My mother died on a Thursday morning in March of 1874, in the bedroom she had slept in for 27 years, in the house she had spent 12 of those years fighting to keep. She died the way she had lived, quietly and without drama, and with her affairs in order. The accounts were reconciled. The tenants at the commercial property on the main street had been notified of the management transition 2 weeks earlier, when it became clear that the end was approaching and that the transition needed to happen before rather than after. Because my mother understood, with the specific practical intelligence that had governed every decision she made in her adult life, that the worst time to make an administrative change is in the middle of a crisis, and that her death, whatever else it was also an administrative change that required preparation. The documents she wanted me to have were in the box on the writing desk, labeled in her handwriting, organized in the way she organized everything, which was the way you organize things when you understand that you will not be there to explain them, and that the explaining has to be done by the documents themselves. Each envelope was sealed and labeled with its contents and the name of the person it was intended for. Mine was the largest. It contained the property deed, the commercial lease agreements, the account records from the Citizens Bank, and a letter written in her handwriting on 4 pages of the good paper she kept for correspondence that mattered. I did not read the letter on the Thursday morning she died. There were too many other things that the Thursday morning required, the notifications and the arrangements, and the specific administrative work of managing the transition from a person's presence to their absence, work that my mother had prepared me for by example over 30 years, and that I executed on that Thursday and in the days that followed, with the composed efficiency she had modeled every day of my life. I read the letter on the Sunday evening after the burial, sitting in the gallery of the house she had left me, in the chair she had sat in every evening for 27 years, with the fig trees in the courtyard below dropping their early spring buds onto the stones in the last of the afternoon light. The letter said what I expected it to say, which was practical and specific and exact, containing no sentiment that was not also instruction, no tenderness that was not also information. She told me the specific condition of each financial account and what she expected from each in the coming year. She told me which tenants at the commercial property were reliable and which required closer attention. She told me the specific legal instruments that still governed the commercial property, the last remnants of Philippe Renard's 12-year campaign against her, and she described, in the precise language she used for everything that required precision, exactly what remained to be done to clear them completely and how she expected me to go about doing it. At the end of the letter, on the final half page after all the practical information had been given, she wrote this. She wrote that she knew I understood what the house was and what it had cost and what holding on to it had required, because I had been inside the holding on for the entire 12 years it had lasted, and that she was not going to explain those things to me because I already knew them better than she could explain them. She wrote that what she wanted me to know, what she had written the letter to say in addition to the practical information that could have been conveyed in a formal document, was that the 12 years had not only taken from her, they had also given her something she had not expected to receive, which was the daily evidence, sustained over 12 years, of what the people around her were willing to do and to risk and to give on behalf of something they believed mattered, and that this evidence had changed her understanding of what was possible between people in ways that the rest of her life had confirmed rather than diminished. She signed it with her full name, Celestine Renard Freeman, the name she had used for 27 years, the name that contained within it the name of the man who had freed her and the name she had given herself, the name she had signed to legal documents and rental agreements and letters to Fontenot, and the journal she had kept throughout the litigation and the application for the bank account, and every other document that required a signature, and that she had signed with the full force of a person who understood that a name is not simply a label but a claim, and that her claim was valid and documented and not subject to being disputed by anyone's legal challenge, not anymore, not after 1859. I sat in the gallery and I read the letter until the light was gone, and then I sat in the dark for a while, and then I went inside and I began the work she had left me, which was the work of continuing what she had built, and I have been doing that work every day for the 30 years since, And I intend to keep doing it for whatever time remains to me, because holding on to something your mother spent 12 years fighting for is not a burden. It is a vocation. It is the most specific form that love takes, when love has something concrete to be applied to, something that can be managed and maintained and grown and handed on. I want to describe my mother as she was before the litigation began, because the account of the 12 years is not fully intelligible without the account of the 22 years that preceded it, the 22 years during which she became the person who was capable of doing what the 12 years required. She was born enslaved in 1809, the daughter of Violette, a seamstress, and Henri, a carpenter who built furniture for the Marchand family and who had, my mother told me, the specific kind of skill that makes itself visible in everything a person touches, the skill that produces not just things that function, but things that are worth looking at, that carry in their construction the evidence of someone who cared about the difference between adequate and excellent. Henri built half the fine furniture in the Marchand plantation house and was never asked to sit in any of it. My mother told me this not as a complaint, but as a fact, because she understood that facts stated plainly are more powerful than complaints, and that the plain statement of a fact carries within it everything the complaint would say without the complaint's tendency to invite dismissal. She came to my father's household at 22, acquired from the Marchand estate when the estate changed hands, and the new owners made decisions about its human inventory that the old owners had not made. She came as property, and she was property for the first 16 years she lived in that house. And I want to be honest about that, because honesty about what something is the foundation of any accurate account of what it becomes, and what it became was something that neither the law of Louisiana nor the social world of Baton Rouge had a category for. My father was 38 when she came to his household. He had never married. He had the means and the social position to have made a conventional marriage years earlier, and had not, for reasons that he explained to my mother once, late in their years together, that she repeated to me when I was old enough to understand them. He said he had never found a woman whose company he preferred to solitude. He said this to my mother. She told me this with the small, specific smile she used when something was simultaneously true and absurd, which was a combination that she found more interesting than either quality alone. Over 16 years, the household they managed together became a life shared completely. I was born in 1832, Thomas in 1835, Marie in 1838. We grew up in a household that was not simple, and that we understood from an early age was not simple in the specific way that children understand the complexity of their own situations before they have the language to describe it, which is to say in the body, in the texture of daily experience, in the specific quality of attention that the adults around them bring to certain subjects and the specific quality of silence they bring to others. My father taught me to read accounts when I was 8 years old. He sat with me at the writing desk in the room he used for the household's business, and he showed me how the columns related to each other, and how to read a balance, and how to identify the places where a set of accounts was telling you something you needed to know. He taught this to me with the patient precision of a man who understood that what he was teaching was not simply arithmetic, but a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding that things which appear in one form can be read to reveal what they actually are, and that the ability to do this reading is a form of power that does not depend on physical strength or legal status, or any of the things that the world around us insisted were the only real forms of power. I was 15 when he died. I had been managing the household accounts alongside my mother for 2 years by then, because my father had been ill, and the management had gradually shifted, and the shifting had been so gradual that by the time he died, it had already been effectively accomplished. And what his death changed was not who was doing the work, but the legal conditions under which it was being done, which changed entirely and immediately, and set in motion everything that followed. Philippe Renard filed the first challenge 3 weeks after my father's burial. I was 15 years old and I did not yet understand what the challenge meant in practical terms, how long it would take, what it would cost, what it would require from my mother and from all of us. What I understood was the look on my mother's face when Fontenot came to the house and explained what had been filed. I have described that look in my mind many times in the 50 years since I first saw it. It was not fear. Fear was something my mother felt. I am certain of that, because she was a person, and persons feel fear, and the situation she was in was genuinely frightening in ways that were specific and concrete and not reducible to anything softer. But fear was not what I saw in her face when Fontenot told her what Philippe had filed. What I saw was the settling, the gathering, the specific reorganization of a person who has received information that requires a fundamental decision and who is making that decision in real time in front of you, and whose face shows the making of it even as the face is trying to remain composed. She decided in those seconds to fight, not as a temporary response to an immediate provocation, as a permanent commitment for however long the provocation continued. I watched her make that decision, and I understood, watching it, that whatever was coming was going to be long and serious and was going to require from my mother everything she had, and that she had made the decision knowing this, which meant she believed what she was fighting for was worth everything it would cost. Fontenot was 60 years old when the litigation began, a man who had practiced law in Baton Rouge for 35 years and who had drafted my father's documents with visible professional discomfort but genuine professional care. The discomfort of a man doing something that his professional world did not expect him to do, and the care of a man whose professional pride required that what he did be done correctly, regardless of whether the professional world expected it. He had decided, before the first challenge was filed, that he was going to defend the documents he had drafted, and his defense of them over 12 years was the most complete professional commitment I have ever observed at close range, sustained not by ideology, because Fontenot was not an ideological man, but by the craftsman's specific refusal to accept that something he had built correctly should be allowed to fail. The first challenge argued that my father had not been of sound mind when he signed the documents. It argued this, despite the physician's certification, despite Fontenot's own testimony about my father's mental state, despite the careful and legally precise construction of the documents themselves. It argued it because the argument was not primarily legal, but social, because the social world of Baton Rouge in 1847 found it more comfortable to believe that the act was a symptom of impairment than to accept the more disturbing possibility, which was that a white man of sound mind in Louisiana in 1847 had looked at the world around him clearly and decided to do something the world did not want him to do. My mother attended every proceeding. She sat in the gallery designated for free people of color, and she listened with the absolute attention she brought to everything that mattered. She had told Fontenot before the first proceeding that she would be present at every proceeding, regardless of his advice about whether her presence was advisable, and she had said this in the tone she used when a decision had been made, and the conversation about it was therefore closed. Fontenot had accepted this and had not raised it again. I attended with her. Not from the first proceeding, because at 15 I was not yet the person who could be useful in a courtroom, and my mother understood this and did not take me immediately. But from the third proceeding, and from everyone after that, I sat beside my mother in the gallery and I listened and I began systematically to learn. The first challenge was resolved in 1849, 2 years after it was filed. The resolution was in my mother's favor. It was narrow, addressing only the specific procedural question of whether the physician's certification was sufficient evidence of competence, and it left several avenues open for continued challenge. But it was a ruling in my mother's favor, and it was the first solid ground she had stood on since my father's death, and I watched her receive it in the gallery, with the same composed face she brought to everything, and I knew, watching her face, that what she felt beneath the composure was significant and real. I decided in the second year of the litigation that I was going to help my mother win it. I want to be precise about what that decision meant when I made it, because at 16 I was not yet capable of helping in any way that was directly useful to the legal proceedings, and the decision was therefore primarily a decision about how I was going to spend my time and my attention in the years that followed, which is not a small decision even when it appears to be. I started with the documents. My mother kept the case files on the writing desk, organized in the way she organized everything, and in the evenings she reviewed them, and I began sitting with her in the evenings and following the reviews, asking questions when I did not understand something, and listening to the answers with the full attention I had learned from both my parents to bring to things that mattered. My mother answered my questions with the patience of someone who understood that teaching me was itself a form of building the defense, that another person who understood the case from the inside was more useful than any number of people who understood it from a summary. By 18, I could follow a legal document without difficulty. By 20, I had read all the case files in sufficient depth that I understood not just what each document said, but how it related to the others, what arguments each one was designed to support or undermine, where the logical connections were and where the gaps were, and which gaps were the ones that mattered most. I was not a lawyer. I had no formal training and no formal access to legal education. What I had was years of reading everything and asking questions about everything, and developing in the specific way that intensive engagement with a complex body of material over a long period develops a person, which is from the inside, in the way that genuine understanding develops, rather than from the outside in the way that surface familiarity develops. I also learned the commercial property. My mother had been managing it since before my father's death, and she continued managing it through the litigation, because the property's income was the foundation of the estate's finances, and the estate's finances were the foundation of the defense, and anything that was foundational to the defense was something my mother managed with her full attention, regardless of everything else that was competing for that attention. I learned by watching her, then by helping her, then by taking on specific tasks within the management while she focused on other aspects of it, and by the time I was 22, I was managing the accounts independently while my mother reviewed them, which is the position I held until her health declined and the reviewing became managing and the managing became independent in the full sense. The property was a building on the main street of Baton Rouge that my father had acquired 15 years before his death. It had 3 commercial tenants during the years I managed it alongside my mother and 4 during the years I managed it independently, each transition requiring the specific work of finding a new tenant, negotiating terms, executing a lease, and establishing the working relationship that made a tenancy function smoothly over time. I learned all of this work by doing it, which is the only way to learn it, and what I learned in the doing of it was not just the mechanics of property management, but something more fundamental, which was how to conduct myself in a commercial context as a person whose authority was not automatic and whose competence had to be established through performance, rather than assumed on the basis of position. This was a different challenge from the legal work, which had rules and procedures and a formal framework within which competence could be demonstrated. The commercial work had no formal framework. What it had was the accumulation of small, reliable acts, repeated consistently over time, that built the reputation that made the next act possible. I built that reputation over years, and the building of it was itself one of the things the litigation produced in me, because the litigation was the context in which I was doing it, and the context shaped the doing in ways I could feel even when I could not articulate them. The filing I found in the 5th year of the litigation is the part of the story that people ask me about most when they hear it, because it has the quality of a turning point, a clear before and after, which stories need and which real life provides only occasionally, and in forms that are usually more complicated and less clean than the story's need for them requires. I want to describe it accurately because the accuracy matters more to me than the drama. I had been reviewing the case records for 2 years by the time I found it. Not just the records of our own case, but the broader records of Louisiana notarial practice that Fontenot had accumulated in his office over 35 years of practice, and that I had been working through systematically, looking for anything that might be relevant to the procedural challenge that Philippe's lawyers were then pressing. The procedural challenge argued that specific procedures required by Louisiana law for a valid manumission had not been correctly followed in my mother's case, and I understood from years of reading case files and listening to Fontenot explain the law that this was the most technically sophisticated challenge Philippe had mounted, and the one whose factual foundation was most difficult to simply assert our way past. I was in Fontenot's archive room on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1852, reviewing a collection of notarial records he had obtained in connection with an entirely different matter that had since been resolved. The collection contained documents spanning 2 decades of Louisiana notarial practice, most of them entirely irrelevant to anything I was looking for, and I was working through them with the systematic attention that sustained searching requires, which is not the excited attention of someone who expects to find something, but the patient attention of someone who understands that not finding something for a long time is simply the condition of searching and not a reason to stop. The filing was in the 3rd folder of the 4th box. It was from 1833, 14 years before my mother's manumission, and it concerned a routine property transaction that had nothing to do with our case and no connection to anyone named in our case. What it contained, buried in its routine details, in the specific language that notarial documents of that period used, was a reference to the standard procedures that had been followed in completing the transaction, a reference that, read against the specific argument Felipe's lawyers were making about what procedures were required, demonstrated that the procedures at issue had been the established practice in Louisiana notarial offices for at least 14 years before my mother's documents were signed. I read it twice. Then I sat with it for a long time, testing my reading of it against what I knew about the procedural challenge and the specific legal points at issue, checking whether I was seeing what was actually there or something I wanted to be there. I had trained myself over years of this kind of work to check for this specific mistake, because the desire to find what you are looking for is a powerful influence on what you see, and a person who cannot distinguish between what is there and what they want to be. There is not useful in a legal defense, however good their intentions are. I was reading it correctly. The filing said what I thought it said. I brought it to my mother that evening. She read it with the careful attention she brought to everything, then read it again, which was what she did when something mattered. Then she looked at me for a moment with the expression I have already described, the expression that was not simply pride, but something more specific. The expression of a woman who has been fighting a long fight and has just received, from the direction she least expected, something that changes the ground beneath her feet. She said, "We take this to Fontenot in the morning." We went in the morning. I sat across from Fontenot's desk in the client's chair, and I explained what I had found and why I thought it mattered, and I watched him read it with the progressive attention of a lawyer encountering something unexpected and working out its implications in real time. When he finished reading, he looked at my mother and then at me and then back at the filing, and he said that I should have been a lawyer. My mother said I probably would have been in a world that permitted it. What I felt in that moment was not simply the satisfaction of having contributed something useful. It was a recognition that the 5 years of the litigation, for all they had cost, had also built something in me that had not existed before they began. A specific capability, a specific way of engaging with complex material under sustained pressure. That was mine, in the way that the house on the good street was my mother's, earned and not subject to being taken away by someone else's claim. The filing shifted the procedural challenge substantially. Felipe's lawyers worked around it for another year, because skilled lawyers can always find ways to extend proceedings, but they could not undo what the filing demonstrated, and the procedural challenge was resolved in my mother's favor in 1854. I was 22. My mother had been fighting for 7 years. We were not done, but we were on different ground than we had been before, and the difference was real and specific and the product of 5 years of sustained work by 2 people who had decided at the beginning that the work was worth doing. I want to be specific about what the community provided during the 12 years of the litigation, because the account would be false without this specificity, because my mother did not do what she did alone, and because the people who helped her deserve to be part of the account, even though most of them would not have wanted their names in a public document, and I will honor that preference by describing what they did rather than who they were. The free black community of Baton Rouge in the 1840s and 1850s was a substantial and organized community with its own institutions, its own economy, its own networks of mutual support and collective understanding, of what was at stake when any one of its members was under the kind of sustained institutional pressure my mother was under. The community attended St. Augustine's Catholic Church, where my mother worshipped every Sunday throughout the litigation, never missing a Sunday, because missing a Sunday would have been a form of retreat, and retreat was something she was not willing to perform even symbolically. The information the community provided was practical and specific. My mother knew through the networks that connected the community's members across the various spaces they occupied in Baton Rouge's social and commercial world, what Philippe was doing and planning before the formal legal record reflected it. She knew when he was meeting with Desmoulins. She knew when he was approaching potential witnesses. She knew when his financial position was changing in ways that affected the resources he was committing to the litigation. None of this information changed the legal proceedings directly, but all of it allowed my mother to prepare for developments before they arrived, which is a form of advantage that is easy to underestimate because its effects are invisible, showing up not as dramatic reversals, but as the absence of the surprises that unprepared people experience. The financial support mattered twice, and the second time more than the first. In the 6th year of the litigation, a combination of the ongoing legal costs and the fire damage at the commercial property produced a financial strain that was the most serious of the 12 years. My mother managed it with the specific discipline of someone who has been managing financial difficulty for long enough to understand exactly how close to the edge she is and exactly what it will take to stay on the right side of it. But the managing required resources that the estate's own accounts, depleted by 5 years of legal fees, could not fully provide. The community organized itself, not dramatically, not through any formal institution or public appeal, but through the specific mechanisms of mutual support that communities develop when they understand that individual situations are connected to collective ones, and that what happens to one person in a system reflects what the system is capable of doing to all of them. Contributions arrived through channels I was not always able to trace, from people I sometimes could not identify, in amounts that were individually modest and collectively sufficient. My mother received these contributions with the specific humility of a person who understands that other people's generosity and risk is not a thing to be treated lightly. And she recorded every contribution in the household accounts as carefully as she recorded every other financial transaction, because the recording was itself a form of acknowledgement, a way of making the contributions part of the permanent record of what the 12 years had contained. The witness testimony was the most visible form of community support, because it was the most public, and therefore the most risky. Men and women from the community testified about my mother's character, her competence, her conduct over the years of the litigation, testifying in a Louisiana courtroom in the 1850s in support of a black woman's property claim, which was not a neutral act and was not received neutrally by the parts of Baton Rouge's establishment that were aligned with Philippe's position. I watched these people take the witness stand, and I have not forgotten any of their names, and I will not record them here, because what they did deserves to be remembered in the way they would have wanted, as a choice made under real conditions at real cost, not as a piece of public record that anyone with access to the right archive could use for whatever purpose they chose. My mother understood the community's support as something she was in relationship with rather than something she was receiving. She contributed to the community throughout the litigation, not at the scale she would have liked because the litigation's costs constrained everything, but consistently, because consistency was part of who she was, and because she understood that relationships are maintained by consistent participation rather than by dramatic gestures made when it is convenient and then abandoned when it is not. Thomas was 12 years old when my father died and 24 when the litigation ended, which means that the entirety of his adolescence was lived under the conditions the litigation produced. He responded to those conditions with the specific anger of a young man who understands that an injustice is being done and who has not yet developed the patience to endure injustice for a long time without allowing the enduring to become consuming. I talked to Thomas during those years the way my mother talked to me, not with advice about how to feel, but with information about what was happening and why and what the available responses to it were. Thomas was not always receptive to these conversations because he was young and the anger was real, and information about strategy is a poor substitute for justice when what you want is justice and what you are getting is strategy. But he listened most of the time, and I believe the listening accumulated in him the way accumulated things eventually do, becoming visible in the person he was by the time the litigation ended, which was a different person than the one who had started it. Thomas became a carpenter. He told me when he decided, looking at me with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is not sure how it will be received, and I told him what I actually thought, which was that our grandfather would have been pleased, and I watched the expression on his face change when I said this, because Thomas had not known Henri, except through what my mother had told him about Henri, and what she had told him was enough to make Henri present in Thomas in ways that expressed themselves most clearly in the quality of attention Thomas brought to the things he made. He built things that were worth looking at, not just things that functioned, though they functioned, but things that carried in their construction the evidence of someone who cared about the difference between adequate and excellent, which is the most specific inheritance my mother described receiving from Henri, and which Thomas received from my mother's descriptions of Henri, which is a form of transmission that seems too indirect to work, and that apparently works perfectly. Marie was 9 when my father died, and 21 when the litigation ended. She had grown up inside the litigation more completely than either Thomas or me, because she had no memory of the household before it began, no before litigation baseline against which to measure what the litigation was taking or what it was building. She absorbed the litigation the way she absorbed everything, which was completely and without apparent effort, in the way that very intelligent people absorb the conditions of their environment, integrating them into their understanding of the world without needing them to be explained. Marie went to New Orleans after the litigation ended, which surprised no one who had watched her grow up. She had always been heading somewhere further away than where she had started. In New Orleans, she found work with a lawyer who valued what she knew, which was Louisiana property law, in the comprehensive practical detail that comes from having lived inside a major property case for 12 years, and who was willing to pay her for knowing it. In 1860, a black woman being paid for legal knowledge by a white lawyer in New Orleans was not an unremarkable thing. It was remarkable. Marie treated it as ordinary, because treating it as ordinary was both what she genuinely felt and what the situation required, which was the specific combination that my mother had always brought to remarkable situations, and that Marie had absorbed from 30 years of proximity to my mother doing exactly that. The final phase of the litigation, from 1854 to 1859, was the most technically demanding. Philippe's lawyers had exhausted the unsound mind argument and the procedural defect argument and had moved to their third and most sophisticated challenge, which concerned the specific legal capacity of a free woman of color in Louisiana to hold the forms of property described in the bequest. Louisiana's laws regarding the property rights of free people of color were genuinely complicated and genuinely shifting throughout this period. And Philippe's lawyers were skilled enough to find the complications and press on them in ways that required from Fontenot and from my mother a level of sustained engagement that the earlier phases had not required to the same degree. There were questions about the specific form in which certain properties were held that had no clean answer in the existing case law, and questions about the application of certain statutes to situations that the statutes had not been specifically drafted to address. And navigating all of it required, in addition to Fontenot's legal expertise, the kind of comprehensive practical knowledge of the estate's specific circumstances that my mother and I had accumulated over years of managing it. I was 22 when the final phase began, and 26 when it ended. The 5 years are difficult to describe in a way that conveys their texture accurately, because what I remember most is not any specific event or proceeding, but the quality of dailiness, the specific experience of living for 5 years inside an unresolved legal question whose resolution would determine whether the house you lived in and the property you managed and the life you had built around those things were actually yours. The financial management of the estate through those 5 years was the most demanding aspect of what I was doing. The legal fees had been accumulating for 7 years by the time the final phase began, and the available resources, while sufficient, were not comfortable, in the sense that comfort implies a margin between what you have and what you need that produces ease rather than vigilance. I managed without comfort and with vigilance, which is a different kind of managing and requires from the person doing it a sustained attention to the relationship between income and expenditure that does not allow for the kind of inattention that comfortable margins permit. My mother and I reviewed the accounts together every week throughout the final phase, sitting at the writing desk in the evenings, going through the numbers with the specific attention we both brought to things that mattered. These sessions were among the most important times of the litigation, not because of any specific decision they produced, but because the regularity of them, the weekly confirmation that the estate's finances were understood and managed and not deteriorating in ways that were not being noticed, was itself a form of control in a situation in which most of the control was held by other people. The ruling came in 1859. It was a ruling of the Louisiana Supreme Court, and it upheld the manumission and the bequest in their essential elements, which meant that my mother's freedom was confirmed, her ownership of the house was confirmed, and her title to the commercial property, while subject to the encumbrances Philippe's lawyers had managed to attach to it in the final years, was confirmed in its essential validity. The encumbrances were real and required several years of subsequent work to clear, but they were encumbrances on something that was definitively mine, and the difference between that and the alternative was the difference between the 12 years being worth it and the 12 years being loss. My mother was 50 when the ruling came. She sat in the gallery that evening, and I sat with her, and we did not talk very much, because there was not much that needed to be said that had not been said over 12 years. And what had not been said was not something that the evening called for saying. We sat in the familiar silence that develops between people who have lived and worked in close proximity through years of difficulty. The silence of people who understand each other well enough not to need to explain to each other what they are feeling. Philippe Renard died in 1862. I learned this through the networks that had kept us informed throughout the litigation, and I felt at his death something I had not expected to feel, which was not relief and not satisfaction, but a complicated quiet, a recognition that the 12 years between us had consumed something real in all of us, that the litigation had not only been about a house and a commercial property, and the legal principle that a document executed correctly should be honored regardless of the race of the person it protected. It had also been about what sustained institutional hostility does to the people it targets, and the people who organize it, and the people who witness it from inside and outside. And Philippe's death closed a chapter in a story that had required 12 years to write, but that had been finished in the essential sense 3 years earlier in the Louisiana Supreme Court. My mother spent the years between the ruling and her death building, not dramatically, not in ways that drew attention to themselves, but steadily and consistently in the way that she did everything. She cleared the encumbrances from the commercial property, working through the legal process with Fontenot, who was 72 years old by then, but who brought to the clearing of the encumbrances the same sustained professional attention he had brought to the 12 years of litigation, because Fontenot was the kind of man who did not consider a job finished until it was actually finished, and who understood, without needing to be told, that the encumbrances were the last remnant of Philippe's 12-year campaign, and that their clearing was the final act of the defense he had committed himself to more than a decade earlier. She restored the bank account to a level that felt genuinely stable rather than strategically maintained, which required several years of careful management during which the commercial property's income was directed primarily toward the account rather than toward the improvements to the house and the property that she would have preferred to fund. She managed this with the same discipline she had applied to everything financial for 27 years, and by the time her health began to decline in the early 1870s, the account stood at a level that she described, in the practical language she always used for financial matters, as sufficient, which was my mother's highest financial compliment. She began in the final years before her health declined to think about what she wanted the property and its income to accomplish beyond providing for her own household and the households of her children. She had discussions with me and with Thomas and with Marie in her letters to New Orleans about the specific forms that this accomplishment might take, and she had conversations with leaders of the community about what the educational institutions that the community had built needed most, and how the property's income might most usefully contribute to providing it. She did not complete this work before she died. She designed it and documented it and handed it to me to execute, in the box on the writing desk, and in the 4-page letter that was the last substantial thing she wrote, and I executed it in 1876, 2 years after her death, establishing the arrangement she had designed and maintaining it since then as one of the primary uses of the property's income. The arrangement directs a specific portion of the commercial property's annual income to the educational institutions of the free black community of Baton Rouge, institutions that provide schooling to children who would not otherwise have access to formal education of any quality. The arrangement is documented in the same legal form that the property itself is documented, because my mother understood that arrangements without legal documentation are not arrangements but intentions, and that intentions without documentation do not survive the people who hold them. She learned this more thoroughly than any other lesson of her life from the 12 years of litigation which had demonstrated in the most comprehensive and sustained way imaginable, both that legal documentation of rights could be contested for 12 years by people with resources and lawyers and social support, and that the documentation was nevertheless what ultimately determined the outcome, that the contesting, however sustained and however well-resourced, could not overturn what had been correctly documented and correctly executed, and that the correct execution of documentation was therefore not a bureaucratic formality, but the most fundamental form of protection available in a world where the alternative to documentation was the vulnerability of the undocumented. I am 60 years old now. I have been managing the house and the property for 30 years, since my mother's death, and I have been doing the work she designed in the final years of her life and handed to me to continue, and I intend to keep doing it for whatever time remains, because the work does not end when the person who began it ends. It continues for as long as the thing being worked on continues, and the thing being worked on is something my mother spent 27 years building, and that I intend to spend whatever years I have maintaining and extending in the directions she pointed before she died. Thomas died in 1891 at the age of 56, of the specific illness that takes men who have worked with their bodies for their entire lives, and that took him faster than any of us expected. He left behind him, in Baton Rouge and in the surrounding area, buildings that are still standing and that will still be standing when everyone who knew him is gone. Buildings that carry in their construction the evidence of someone who understood that the difference between adequate and excellent is not a small difference but the most important one, and who refused in everything he built to produce anything that was merely adequate when he had the skill and the time and the materials to produce something excellent. Marie is still in New Orleans. She is 56 years old, and she is still working, managing the legal knowledge she accumulated growing up in our household into a practice that has expanded well beyond the original relationship with the lawyer who first employed her. She has built in New Orleans in the specific context of post-war Louisiana, where the reconstruction and subsequent dismantling of Reconstruction has produced a legal landscape of extraordinary complexity, a position for herself that is anomalous and remarkable, and that she treats as simply the next stage of work that she has always been doing, which is the specific characteristic of people who build things gradually over time, that each stage seems natural and unremarkable to the person doing it, even when it appears extraordinary to everyone watching. I sit in the gallery in the evenings, the way my mother sat in the gallery in the evenings. The house is the same house, maintained over 30 years, with the specific attention that a house requires when the house is also a statement, not in the rhetorical sense, but in the simple, factual sense of being a visible daily fact about what is possible. The courtyard is the same courtyard. The fig trees that Henri planted are enormous now, their branches reaching above the gallery railing and across the walls on both sides of the courtyard, their roots lifting the courtyard stones in the patient way that roots lift stones when they have been growing long enough in the same place. The trees drop their fruit in the autumn, with the indifference of things that have been doing this for longer than any of the people who have ever lived near them, and they will continue doing it after I am gone, and after whoever comes after me is gone. And this indifference is not a failure of the trees, but a quality of them that I have come to understand, over 30 years of watching them from this gallery, as a form of consolation. Not everything that matters requires human intention to persist. Some things persist simply because they are rooted deeply enough in good soil, and the rooting is its own guarantee of persistence, independent of whether anyone tends the trees or acknowledges them or understands what they are doing there. My mother is buried in St. Vincent de Paul Cemetery. The stone reads Celestine Renard Freeman, 1809 to 1874. She held on. I visit regularly and I tell her what has happened since her death, not because I believe she can hear me, but because speaking the account aloud is a way of maintaining the discipline of accuracy, of continuing to see the situation as it actually is rather than as I would like it to be, which is a discipline that the 12 years taught both of us, and that I have tried, in the 30 years since her death, to maintain with the same consistency she brought to it. What I tell her is this: the house is standing, the property is producing. The arrangement she designed is funding the education of children who would not otherwise be educated. The fig trees her father planted are still growing. Thomas built things that lasted. Marie is still working. The work she began is being continued by people who understand what it cost to begin it. She held on for 12 years against the organized effort of people with resources and lawyers and social support behind them. She held on for 15 more years after the litigation ended, building what the litigation had been fought to protect. She died in the house she had held on to, in the bed she had slept in for 27 years, with her affairs in order and her children around her and the fig trees in the courtyard below the window. She held on. I am holding on. The trees are still growing. That is what I have to tell. That is the whole of the account. That is everything.
This account is presented as a first-person historical narrative told from the perspective of Josephine, eldest daughter of Celestine Renard Freeman, reflecting the documented legal history of one of the most significant property defense cases involving a free woman of color in antebellum Louisiana. East Baton Rouge. Parish notarial records document the manumission and bequest executed by Augustin Renard in September 1847. The subsequent litigation, documented in Louisiana Supreme Court records, is studied by historians of Louisiana legal history as one of the most extensively documented property cases involving a free woman of color in the antebellum period. The Freeman family papers, donated to the Louisiana State Archives in 1952, include Celestine's journal of the litigation, Josephine's management records for the commercial property, and correspondence between family members that forms the basis of this account. Celestine Freeman died in Baton Rouge in 1874 and is buried in St. Vincent de Paul Cemetery. Josephine Freeman. Turreau continued managing the family's property holdings in Baton Rouge until her own death in 1908 at the age of 76. The charitable arrangement she established in 1876, directing a portion of the commercial property's income to the educational institutions of Baton Rouge's Black community, is documented in the property's legal records and continued to operate under various forms of management until the property itself was sold by her descendants in 1931. If Josephine's account of her mother's fight moved you, if you believe that holding on is its own form of courage and that the people who do the holding on behalf of those who come after them deserve to be remembered in the full complexity of what the holding required, subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what stayed with you most. The Thursday morning, the box on the writing desk, the filing that changed the case, the fig trees, the 4 words on the gravestone, the work that continues. Subscribe, comment, and share so these stories keep being told.